The Right Honourable Sir Anand Satyanand, Her Excellency Lady Susan Satyanand, Your Excellency Sri Avanindra Pandi, High Commissioner for India to New Zealand, the Right Honourable Winston Peters, Leader of New Zealand First Party and former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Dr Russell Norman, the Leader of the Green Party, Dr Rajan Prasad, Labour Member of Parliament and former Race Relations Conciliator and Families Commissioner, Penny Hulls, Deputy Mayor of Auckland, Mr Kanwaljit Singh Bakshi, National Member of Parliament, Your Honour Judge Ajit Singh, Judge of the District Court, Ramesh Subramaniam, Head of South Asian Banking at ANZ, Robert Khan, Managing Director of Radio Tirana. Can I also acknowledge my mother and father, Professor Chen and Mrs Jean Chen. How nice it is to see you here.
We have the honour and privilege of Mr. Ramayah as our guest speaker, a corporate chief known for his business acumen and international operations, known for honesty and integrity. He has been the chief pilot who has taken organizations to new heights of productivity and profitability over the years. We have instituted this lecture series as a focal point for good governance, which is so essential to success as business people, organization, and as individuals. I am sure you'll find this lecture useful in ordering your own state of affairs. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, I welcome you to this significant event. I am sure you'll enjoy this evening and make it useful too. Thank you very much indeed for your presence here tonight.
This is the third occasion on which I've stood here on an evening in late July at the commencement of a lecture bearing my name. It is an unusual experience being here for such a purpose, because it is much more usual for people to pass on to another jurisdiction before such an event with their name on the masthead is planned and delivered. May I first then acknowledge, with the enthusiasm of someone who's very much living and liking it, those many of you who are present in comforting and well-dressed numbers this evening. Looking about you, into the room, I recognise many faces from Auckland and beyond, and from many parts of our legal, government and business communities. I acknowledge a number of you holding office. Your Excellency Sri Avanindra Pandi, High Commissioner for India to New Zealand, and Mrs Pandi, the Right Honourable Winston Peters, Leader of the New Zealand First Party and former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade, unusually occupying, if I may respectfully say so, Winston, the left wing from where I stand. Dr Russell Norman, Member of Parliament and co-leader of the Greens Party. Dr Rajan Prasad, Labour Member of Parliament, and our country's former Race Relations Conciliator and Chief Families Commissioner, Mr Kanwaljit Singh Bakshi, National Member of Parliament, Penny Hulls, Deputy Mayor of Auckland, Your Honour Judge Ajit Singh, Judge of the District Court, Ramesh Subramaniam of the ANZ South Asian Banking Operation, Robert Khan, Director of Radio Tirana, Denham Shale, erstwhile Head of the Institute of Directors, Brent Impey of Media Works, distinguished guests otherwise, ladies and gentlemen, as you will know from those many of you that I know personally, I'd be happy enough to acknowledge each one of you because of the compliment that is offered by your presence. However, to do so for the 200 or so people who are here at the moment would trespass on your patience, as well as on the time to be spent in a few moments from now enjoying the cuisine of this fine hotel. I want, though, to acknowledge two indefatigable figures who have created over the past decade a quality newspaper which covers many issues of particular interest to New Zealanders of Indian origin and more generally. Raveen Lal and Venkat Raman, Managing Director and Editor respectively of Indian Newslink. I think if there is any quibble with the description indefatigable, one should simply ring Auckland 533-6377 and listen to Raveen's voicemail message, or to spend even 30 seconds on the phone to Venkat, as he brings a new meaning to the term multitasking. This lecture, now in its third year, can be said to be developing a tradition of delivering to a discerning audience a worthwhile contribution to the discourse about principle and administration and law and governance. Taking the word tradition from its Latin root tradere, to give for safekeeping, I can say that the contributions in the past 2 years from Secretary for Foreign Affairs John Allen and Business New Zealand Chief Executive Phil O'Reilly have certainly filled that bill. Both lectures have emphasised the need for standards and their maintenance. This year, 2013, seems to me a very good time for you, Mei Chen, to be MC, and for you, Vino Ramayah, to be the lecturer. During the past several months, a number of events have occurred which have rated New Zealand's standing in the world on the matter of openness and credibility. The Corruption Perception Index, the CPI, authored in Germany in December 2012, rated New Zealand number 1 equal and with a score of 90 out of a possible 100. In January and February this year, however, a poll within New Zealand was conducted by the reputable organisation Colmar Brunton and was included in an international study published just a few weeks ago. This stated that more than half of the world's people believe that global corruption has worsened over the past 2 years, and they found a lack of trust in the police, the courts, and political parties. The New Zealand component of the survey involved 1,000 New Zealanders, and they found things that like 3% of those surveyed reporting having paid a bribe. The reasons stated for doing so ranged from it being the only way to obtain a service in order to obtain cheaper service, to speed things up, or as a gift in gratitude. Some of this was quite shocking for many New Zealanders. Lastly, as I speak, the New Zealand chapter of Transparency International, of which I'm patron, is completing a 7-month intensive study of our country's public sector, and the matter of transparency and its adherence will be addressed in results which will begin to be published in the next few weeks. So it just seems to me that it's timely for the lecture to occur. I used the word suitability. You, Mei Chen, have developed a more and more well-known and respected profile as a public law practitioner, as a law teacher, and as a contributor to public discourse on radio and television. you seem hugely well identified to be the person leading this event tonight. You, Vino Ramayah, in your business, which encompasses New Zealand, Singapore, India and other countries, are uniquely well qualified because you have studied law and business, and in both fields you have excelled. You lead your companies which are engaged at the leading edges of medical technology, ICT and biotechnology. The three of us, May, Vino and myself, have spent time either following each other on or being together on the board of the Asia New Zealand Foundation, which has been a catalyst for more knowledge and communication between our country and Asian settings. Some of those appointments and commissions arose during your watch as the relevant Minister, Winston Peters. What you say, Vino particularly, but also you, May, will be both interesting and challenging, I have little doubt. As I finish this curtain-raising aspect, may I thank those responsible for involving Susan and I in the arrangements. Beyond Venkat and Raveen, there is the management and staff of this hotel, as well as the staff of Indian Newslink. And I want to acknowledge Paul Evans and Sunny Kaushal of this hotel for their cooperation and versatility. To end my contribution, may I say this. The proper focus for us this evening is on issues related to good governance in our country and those in our country's institutions, such as business. The values we hold dear in life are not any birthright. They are grounded in the values of those who have preceded us, formed and shaped through education and through interactions with peers, colleagues and role models. And they are expected by customers and clients of business. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that my curtain raising has made anticipation of Vino Ramayah's address something that will remain memorable after he speaks, when he is asked to do so by Mei Chen at the conclusion of the main course. To finish, I am one who has long admired the phrase of Robert Louis Stevenson, which is becoming a byword for this occasion. Every heart that has beat strongly and cheerfully has left a hopeful impulse behind it in the world and bettered the tradition of mankind. With a heart that is beating strongly and cheerfully, may I thank you for your kind and courteous attention and wish you a good evening. Thank you.
The guest speaker is Mr. Vino Ramayah. He's a corporate leader. He's known for his business acumen, and the reason is because he's been successful in many parts of the world. For those of us who are in business, it's tough, and it's tough in New Zealand, but this man has managed to grow and develop his business not just in New Zealand, also in Australia and Asia and in other places. Now, Vino's been involved in the development, growth and management of healthcare technology companies in all of those countries. He's lived and worked in several countries, including England, Singapore and South Africa. He was born in Singapore, where he completed his early schooling, and he served as a commissioned officer in the Singapore Armed Forces during his national service. Now, something you probably don't know. I didn't know this, Vino. Vino's a pilot. And he's a lawyer. He obtained a Bachelor of Laws honours degree from the University of Singapore, a very good university, a Master of Laws postgraduate degree from the University of London, and a diploma in airspace law from the London School of Economics. He's a member of the Royal Aeronautics Society and a qualified solicitor of the Supreme Court of England and Singapore. If you'd like to apply for a role at Chimpang, I promise to view it most favourably. He's a qualified pilot and a flying enthusiast. He's practiced corporate and commercial law internationally in several countries and served as a director on a number of multinational companies, particularly in the aviation industry. Now, he is currently the Executive Director of MedTech Global Limited, a publicly listed company on the Australian Stock Exchange. The company has been providing award-winning technology solutions to the primary healthcare sector worldwide for 28 years. Under his leadership, MedTech Global has expanded its offerings in Australasia in primary, secondary and tertiary healthcare and increased its market share in New Zealand, Australia, India, Ireland and the US.
Sir Anand's career exemplifies good governance. First as a judge, subsequently as an ombudsman, and then to becoming New Zealand's 19th Governor General. His tenure in office will go into the history of this country as the first Asian to have risen to this role. Sir Anand was recently appointed as the chairman of the Commonwealth Foundation, a foundation whose worthy vision is to promote sustainable growth in an equitable and peaceful manner throughout the Commonwealth. I have known Sir Anand for a number of years and had the privilege of serving under him when he was deputy chair of the Asian New Zealand Foundation. I've always admired him and his keen intellect, and particularly his good judgment and wisdom. The topic today is transparency, a myth of reality, which is a topic which is very close to Sir Anand's heart. And I'm indeed honored and privileged to present the third lecture in his name. But before I present this lecture, can I say a few acknowledgements? There's a lot of friends and colleagues who helped me along the way as I came to this stage of being able to present the lecture. I want to mention a few. Firstly, Venkat, who was tracking me with a GPS around the world and ensured that I was here tonight to deliver the lecture. But more importantly, his astute journalistic skill and perspectives on the topic of transparency was fascinating. Secondly, Dr. Rajan Prasad, who not only brought a dimension of a social scientist, but being a politician, was able to add many perspectives which I didn't really appreciate. I also want to thank my good friend and colleague, Ross Tanner, for reviewing my drafts and giving me his very insightful comments, having been in Crown services in government before. Of course, there's my friend Ian Howard, who gave me a very colloquial view of what transparency meant to the ordinary Kiwi. All of you, thank you. But last but not least, I want to thank my family. 3 of them are here. My youngest boy was upset that he couldn't come here, but I said I'll mention his name. Now, my family provided me with inspiration, but more importantly, we had robust dinner table conversations about the topic of transparency. And many of the discussion points are actually included in this lecture. I wish to state that any comment I make tonight is entirely my own and personal view, and does not represent any of the organizations I either chair or am part of. Now, for those of you who've been, particularly Venkat, who's been tracking me, he's been sending me emails which I've collected all over the world. recently I was on a world tour which took me to the United States, Europe, India, and then on to Singapore and for a family holiday in Bali. I was traveling to Bali with my family, and my young son, Vijay, who's 10 years old, was seated beside me. And I was busily making notes for this lecture. Vijay interrupted me and said, "What are you doing? We're going on a holiday. Why are you working so hard?" And I said, "Well, I've got this lecture to deliver when I get back to Auckland." He said, "What are you going to speak about?" And I said, "Hey, it's about telling the truth." And he said, "What? Are you speaking to children?" And I said, "No, some very important adults." And he said, "For how long will you have to speak for?" I said, "About 20 minutes. And he said, "Papa, you know what? Tell them some jokes. All adults know they must speak the truth." That's a 10-year-old's perspective of the topic. Our mothers always told us, speak the truth. Don't tell lies. Is transparency a fancy way of saying the same thing? We equate transparency with truthfulness, honesty, integrity, openness. Transparency is, in our view, a safeguard against corruption, fraud, nepotism, and abuse of power. Transparency is a very complex topic. And in my research, I concluded that you have to balance two conflicting issues. One, the right of an individual to maintain his privacy, the right of corporates to preserve their trade secrets and their intellectual property, right of government and sovereigns to conduct diplomacy and protect national interests, particularly security interests. Transparency makes us vulnerable and accountable. The more powerful, the more influence you exert, the more vulnerable you become. And in today's world, you are more likely to be misrepresented, misconstrued, and whether by the public or virtual media. And so in modern times, we've invented a whole range of tools: spin doctors, PR firms, communication departments, to manage our perception. Machiavelli, in his very famous book, The Prince, says, we manage our perceptions as how we want to be perceived, not how we truly are. Therefore, is transparency a myth? I was in Bangalore, in India, at a very close friend's house. And we had dinner, and he was catching up with me and asking me what's topical in New Zealand. And I proudly told him, hey, you know what? New Zealand has been rated the least corrupt country in the world. We are number 1 out of 176. Fantastic. His 12-year-old son butted in and said, Uncle, you may be the number 1 least uncorrupt country in the world, but we are number 1 in cricket. I quickly refuted him and said, we are number 1 in rugby. Transparency International had a survey, as pointed out by Sir Anand, that fundamentally surveyed 176 countries on what is known as a corruption perception index. It was only of the public sector, not the private sector. What was the outcome? We scored 9.4 last year, 9.3. Last year we did 9.3. And we are number one, sharing the grid with Denmark and Finland. The Corruption Perception Index is only a perception. And I caution you that perception does not always mean it's the truth. And while it is a real good feel factor, I believe it is important for us to recognize that we need to look underneath the covers. The hard truths. Since 2005, 50 companies, finance companies, have gone bust, losing billions of dollars. Thousands of retail investors have lost their money. Give you an example, Bridgecorp, 14,500 investors lost their money, totaling close to $500 million. Move on to capital and merchant finance. About 200 million, 7,500 investors lost their money. Canterbury Finance, South Canterbury Finance, 1.7 billion. PricewaterhouseCoopers did a survey in 2007 and found of the cohort they surveyed, 44% of companies surveyed suffered economic fraud. And the average cost was around $492,000. They did another survey in 2011. Guess what? The figure went up to 50%, against a global average of 34%. We were tracking in the wrong direction. They found that 4% of Kiwis said they had bribed someone, which is twice as high as Australia, 4 times as high as the UK. I'm a bit dubious about the Australian numbers, but we won't go there. We have a serious issue at hand. When we look at the issue of openness, we have to really understand whether this Corruption Perception Index actually is the yardstick. The SFO was set up in 1990 under the Serious Frauds Act, after the aftermath in 1987 of Equity Corp, Chase Corporation, and the collapse of 3,000 companies, all history. The CEO of the SFO, Adam Feely, or the former CEO, says, this Corruption Perception Index is nonsense. I'm investigating 2.2 billion fraud complaints. KPMG, in its paper in 2012, comes out with a statistic which is astounding. Between 2 to 8 billion is what they estimate the size of fraud in New Zealand. The SFO surveyed the NZX 50 companies and found only 44% of these companies had rules regarding corruption and bribery, compared to Australia, 57%, compared to US, 69%, and the UK topped it with 72%, way below. And Adam Feely comes out with a public statement saying very clearly, New Zealand CEOs are very smug because they hold on to this CPI index and think that we're not corrupt. He says, since the global economic crisis, corruption has been on the increase, especially when our trading partners have also changed. And the stresses of economic pressure cause has been identified by KPMG as the single most factor which has caused people to become corrupt, particularly when they are under personal financial strain. The Office of the Auditor General, Lynn Prescott, made a statement last year that while New Zealand has a clean image, the reality is fraud is a way of life in business in New Zealand. She said that 61% of companies with more than 2,000 employees reported a fraud. Not only that, the larger you are, the more predisposed you are to fraud. And when we look at what was announced by the government recently, just this month, at an individual level, 3,000 people were found to have committed welfare fraud, costing the country $33 million. Not only that, we have 20,000 under investigation. What's more, that this discovery happened as a result of a law change enabling two government departments to exchange information. It could be the tip of the iceberg. And when we look at our laws, we have the 1910 Secrets Commissions Act, which is more than 100 years old. You get a smack on your wrists if you commit corruption. There's a $1,000 fine and 2 years imprisonment. And when you go back into, if you're a corporate, you get $2,000 fine. Of course, there are more punitive things. I'm not delving into it too much. Under our Crimes Act 1961, we do have some punitive provisions, but they're all very not as stringent. We have the Serious Frauds Act, which also has some semblance of corruption. But unlike the US and the UK, we don't have extraterritorial jurisdiction legislation. The UK, under the UK Bribery Act, if you committed an offense in the UK or outside the UK in a third country, and you had any business association with the UK, you could be guilty of an offense. Similarly, under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of the US, many large companies have been made to account. Hewlett-Packard is now being investigated for a $50 million fraud, a bribery. Siemens paid a $400 million fine. We have none of these legislation. I understand that Transparency International is advocating a change in the law and bringing in some of these serious changes. I look at the corporate scene. Being a corporate and being transparent has become a bit of a mantra. They say being transparent to your shareholders, to your employees, to your customers is necessarily a good thing and good corporate citizenship. But when you are in a crisis and you have to manage your survival, and your survival dictates become strong, transparency takes a back seat. To illustrate this point, I will talk about a very interesting case study which was conducted by an Ivy League university in the US. The case study revolved around a bunch of MBA students who were given a case study which was around a factual scenario of a pharmaceutical company which had developed a therapeutic drug for delivery in the market. The drug had adverse events, in some instances caused death. The students were given 3 options. First option, do nothing. Second option, contain, manage the media, think of solutions to mitigate the loss to the company. The third option, come clean. Go to the FDA, withdraw the drug, compensate the victims. Guess what? 90% of the students chose option 2. This was a program in ethics. Then they were asked another question. What if a doctor prescribed a drug to you, the same drug to you or your member of your family? Would you take it? The response was 100% unanimous, no. That illustrates the conflict. It is a very trying point. And to bring the point home, I talk about the recent case of Sunlu, which is a Chinese corporation. Fonterra had 43% shares in it. It was manufacturing for sale milk powder in China. In delivering the milk powder, there was contamination with industrial melamine, which effectively had adverse events, adverse reactions, and side effects to the infants. The Fonterra had 3 members representing its 43% interest in Sunlu. Sunlu board became aware of this 6 months before the media announcement, while they were still selling this milk powder contaminated with melamine. Then Fonterra's local board became aware 6 weeks before the media release. Meanwhile, Sunlu was still selling that milk. 300,000 Chinese babies were hospitalized. 6 of them died. Dr. Anne Brady from Canterbury University raised a very interesting point. She said, what would have Fonterra done had it been New Zealand babies? I illustrate these points not to dramatize the situation, but to actually show you the conflict between corporate interests and public interests. It's a very important and pertinent point. Now, when we look at the issue of corporate transparency even further, a Deloitte survey has determined that, this was a Deloitte survey done in 2012 for both Australia and New Zealand. They determined that 44% of companies were trading in high-risk jurisdictions. 21% of them had experienced bribery. Only 30% of them, this is the NZX 50 and the ASX 200, had rules governing corruption and bribery. There is a long way to go. The boards have to wake up to this real issue. We are working in a complex environment. As a lawyer and a businessman, I have had many times to deal with business in high-risk countries, where there is this concept of payment of commissions or consulting fees, just a polite way of calling a bribe. And the result is you end up losing a contract if you are not prepared to do that. The consequence of doing that is a legal one. And, there is a perception in New Zealand. It is okay for us to do it outside New Zealand because we can turn a blind eye and it doesn't really matter. But at home, we wouldn't do it. This I do not accept. It is still possible to do business overseas and actually make money the clean way. Besides, you sleep well at night. Given the level of digitization, computerization, and the movement towards transparency in these high-risk countries, there is greater fraud detection. And that's the good news, because it's going to keep more people honest. I think there is no room for complacency. Directors have to take accountability. And Adam Feely says this: directors don't delegate their duties to auditors. Auditors only uncover 2% of the fraud. They have to own up to their prime responsibility of steering their company with a level of prudence and honesty. I want to talk about transparency from a different perspective, especially the impact of technology. I don't think any of us will have an easy time explaining to our children life before the mobile phone and the internet. Just like our parents had difficulty talking about life before the telephone and the TV. The internet is the largest ungoverned paradigm in the universe today. It has changed lives in a transformational sense in a very short space. Its full social implications are still yet to be unraveled. At the beginning of the century, we had 350 million internet users. Today, we are tracking towards 3 billion. It is expected by 2025 that everyone will have an internet connection, anyone above 12. Mobile phones were 750 million at the beginning of the century. Today, we are tracking towards a $6 billion mark. It is fascinating, the speed at which it is going. Not only that, computational power is increasing. There is a concept in technology called Moore's Law. Computational power doubles every 18 months. If we apply that formula, our computers will be 64 times faster by 2025. Our bandwidth, which is now at around 258 kbps, will move to around 300 Mbps and 500 Mbps to our homes, not a node, which means it's exponentially expanded. Content is doubling every 8 months. And the velocity of information is so rapid. And we are all naked before the internet. We are exposed. We will have to spend a lot of time managing our virtual perceptions because of the risks associated with that. It is fundamental, whether you're an individual, whether you're a business, whether you're part of government, that you understand this phenomenon, because it'll change how we behave and how we act and interact. Now, it is very important to understand that we are the first in the human race whose digital record cannot be erased. Okay. Recently, there was a case before the European Court of Justice, which is the highest court in the European Union. The court has ruled that Google could not be forced to delete its records. And it was an action brought out of Spain, which means anything you do on the internet, any search sites you go to, any LinkedIn you have, any Facebook you have, will be transparent and available. And this will transform. We are indeed going into uncharted territory. I take the example of the Arab Spring and how things move, how rapidly. Every one of you here probably has kept pace with what is going on in Egypt today. But in 2011, we had a situation where Hosni Mubarak closed down the internet. 2 of the mobile phone operators refused to do that. And they went viral, rapidly mobilizing 1 million people into Tahrir Square. 2 weeks later, Hosni Mubarak was gone. It sent shivers around any dictator or despot because of the rapidity of the mobilization. That is the impact of technology. We have a situation, you recall what speed meant. The last presidential election, most of you remember Mitt Romney won the first debate. And between the second and third debate, he made the fatal error of making a private comment to a private fundraising about welfare dependency of 50% of US. It went viral on YouTube. The rest is history. All of you heard of the famous Gangnam Style. Within a month, cross-border, cross-cultural, it absolutely changed the perception of what digitization and movement of information is all about. This will change our precepts of transparency because we have crossed the Rubicon. And to put the genie back into the bottle is not going to be easy. We look at WikiLeaks. Julian Assange, who's locked up in an embassy in Ecuador under asylum. He's got maybe 100 warrants waiting for him outside the Ecuadorian embassy in London. His mission in life and his ethos is information wants to be free. And he wants to expose governments, anyone who has got secret dealings and secret communication. He exposed a whole range of embarrassing state information about communication between the State Department and various governments. And I believe New Zealand was also partly implicated in that. Then we have the newfound hero, Edward Snowden. He worked for the NSA, or the National Security Agency in the US. He revealed that Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, telephones, everything is exposed. And the NSA was investigating in the name of security. President Obama's response was, you can't have 100% security with 100% privacy. And we live in dangerous times. In a world of heightened security, you have to remember security services are going to access information because of national interests. We ourselves have the GCSB debate going on, which is current. I understand from Mr. Bakshi that it's going to be debated tomorrow in Parliament. It is pertinent. What does that mean? The big issue we are confronted with is with the younger generation. Our children will become virtually more mature before they achieve physical maturity, because they will be transcending the boundaries far faster than we have. You would have to talk to them about privacy and security before you have that awkward conversation about sex, because that's their new world. And they don't understand the implications, especially when you cannot delete your records. Your records are there for posterity. And whatever you put in there, whether in LinkedIn, Facebook, whatever, is going to be there for posterity. What is more important is a recent phenomenon which Edward Snowden kind of alluded to as part of the PRISM project, which was the secret project carried out by the National Security Agency. This is the concept of big data. What security agencies are able to do today is apply a principle called non-observable recognition algorithm. What it does is able to do pattern recognition. And pattern recognition means it's almost able to replicate the human brain to recognize non-observable things. And that enables security forces to preempt behavior, preempt your conduct even before you've committed a crime. They're able to say the probability of you doing something is quite there. This is no longer science fiction. I know some of you have watched the Tom Cruise movie, and it's not very far from that. The important thing we have to ask ourselves, is this what we want? Is this consistent with life in a free society as we have known it? Do we want so much transparency? Our laws and legislations, we have a truckload of them. And do these laws, which we are now continuing to legislate in relation to the GCSB, have accountability? The amount of information which authorities are going to hold, are those information, do we know the extent of the information, the use of the information, and the checks and balances which enable government to use those information? These are very real questions. And when we look at all the compliance issue, is more actually less? Having accounting records, international financial reporting standards, I myself, I think, have been confused many times about these standards because of the conflicting opinions offered by my auditors and a few of my professional advisors. Very intriguing. Have they actually prevented WorldCom? Have they prevented Enron, Bear Stearns, or Lehman Brothers? Did you know that Standard & Poor, the agency which was supposed to transparently evaluate bonds, is now being sued around the world on class actions? Did you also know that they were always paid by the issue of the bond? And they were rating those bonds. Lehman was rated AAA 1 month before its collapse. The internet is a totally fascinating paradigm. I was in an airline lounge. I missed a flight trying to get to London, and I was stuck in Washington. And I read a copy of the Wall Street Journal. And there was a caricature of two dogs having a conversation. One dog was saying to the other, The internet is great, fantastic, the greatest invention. The other dog asked why. The first dog replied, no one knows you're a dog. And the reality is our virtual selves have been magnified way beyond our understanding. And the reality of this is just dawning. What encourages transparency? Amongst other things, a strong democratic institutions, a strong judiciary, an existence of a free press or free media, a strong and open political process, rule of law and legislation, which enables freedom of information, and also laced with effective detection and enforcement. But all of these do not guarantee transparency. At the core, it is a balance between individuals' interests and the greater interests of society. I would like to end with a quote from a woman and a saint whom I highly admire, Mother Teresa. Honesty and transparency makes you vulnerable. Be honest anyway. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you.